The dust was a living thing. It rose in lazy, choking clouds from the hooves of passing horses and the scuffed boots of men with nowhere to be. It settled in a fine, red film over everything, coating the warped boards of the saloon porch and filling the cracks in the sun-hammered earth. For the girl, it was the taste of her own defeat. It gritted between her teeth, clung to the damp tangle of her hair, and worked its way into the frayed weave of the burlap sack draped over her head and shoulders. The sack was a crude hood, blinding her to the faces that stared, but not to the heat of their judgment. It smelled of mildew and something sour, like spoiled grain. It chafed her neck, rubbing the skin raw until it burned with a low, constant fire. She was tied to the hitching post outside the mercantile, the rope a rough bracelet around her wrists. It wasn't tight enough to stop the blood, just tight enough to be a declaration of ownership. She belonged to the post, and the post belonged to the town, and the town belonged to men like the one whose voice droned on beside her. She did not hear the words anymore. They had washed over her for what felt like days, a meaningless tide of promises and appraisals. "Good teeth," he'd said earlier, forcing her jaw open for a prospective buyer who had reeked of cheap whiskey. "Strong back," he'd repeated, slapping her between the shoulder blades as if she were livestock. Now, his voice was just a sound, part of the landscape like the buzz of flies or the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. She kept her world small. She focused on the feeling of the splintered wood beneath her bare feet. The ground was hot, almost blistering, but it was real. She could feel its solidness, a truth in a world of lies. She counted the cracks in the dirt, tracing their jagged paths with her mind. She listened to the creak of the mercantile sign swinging in the dry wind. These small, certain things were her only anchor. The crowd was a shifting, murmuring beast. Some watched with open curiosity, others with a veiled, pitiless scorn. A woman in a calico dress pulled her child closer, shielding his eyes. A group of drovers standing in the shade of the saloon's overhang laughed at something the auctioneer said, their laughter sharp and careless. To them, she was a brief diversion, a spectacle to break the monotony of a long, hot afternoon. Soon they would grow bored and drift away, leaving her to the sun and the flies and the waiting. She had learned to make herself small, to retreat into a place deep inside where their words and their eyes could not follow. She was a stone at the bottom of a river, feeling the current pass over her, unmoving. The world could do what it would. She had no fight left. There was only the heat, the dust, and the patient, waiting silence inside her. Elias saw her from across the square, a still, slumped figure tethered in the unforgiving sun. He had come into the settlement of redemption for salt, nails, and a bit of news, not for a market day in human misery. He stood in the deep shadow of the livery, the scent of hay and horse sweat thick in the air. His hands, stained with the earth of his own isolated ranch, curled into loose fists at his sides. He watched Brant work the sparse crowd. Brant was a man whose soul was as thin and cracked as the land around them. He peddled flesh and desperation with the same oily smile he used to sell watered-down whiskey and lame horses. Elias had seen him before, a vulture who circled the misfortunes of others. The girl, she was hardly more than that, did not look up. Her posture was one of utter capitulation, a body that had given up on its own spirit. The burlap sack over her head was the cruelest part. It erased her face, turning her from a person into an object, a thing to be haggled over. It was a detail of profound and deliberate humiliation, and a cold anger, quiet and deep, began to smolder in Elias's chest. It was an old, familiar feeling, an ember he thought had long since gone cold. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He had buried his wife, Martha, and their stillborn son in the hard ground behind his cabin 5 years ago. He had buried his own heart with them, building a wall of silence and solitude around himself brick by patient brick. He knew what it was to be hollowed out, to have the world strip you down to nothing but bone and memory. He watched a farmer in worn overalls approach Brant, poke the girl's arm, and then shake his head and walk away. He saw the flicker of irritation on Brant's face. The heat was driving the audience away. Time was running out. Elias pushed himself off the livery wall. His movements were deliberate, economical. His worn duster settled around him as he walked, his boots raising soft puffs of red dust that hung in the air like ghosts. He didn't hurry. The world had taught him the folly of haste. He stopped directly in front of Brant, casting a long shadow that fell over the girl. Brant, surprised by the sudden interruption, turned. His practiced smile faltered when he saw Elias's face. It was a face that held no room for negotiation, a landscape of quiet grief and unyielding principle. Elias said nothing. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and poured a handful of coins into his calloused palm. There were 5 of them, dull silver against his skin. It was the money for his salt and nails. It was everything he had with him. He held his hand out. Brant's eyes darted from the coins to Elias's face, searching for the angle, the trick. He saw none. He saw only a man who had made a decision. Greed warred with suspicion, and greed won. It was more than he had been offered all day. With a curt nod, he scooped the coins from Elias's palm. The transaction was complete. It had been as silent and final as a stone dropping into a well. Elias turned his back on Brant. He walked the few steps to the hitching post. The girl flinched as his shadow fell on her completely, a sudden coolness in the oppressive heat. She must have thought he was just another buyer, come to inspect his purchase. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the only sign of the terror she held so tightly within. He didn't speak. Words were clumsy things, and he had forgotten how to use them for comfort. Instead, he drew the small, sharp knife he used for whittling and cutting twine. The blade caught a sliver of sunlight. With 2 swift, clean motions, he sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. The severed ends fell into the dust. For a long moment, her hands remained where they were, hovering in the air as if the ropes were still there, phantoms of restraint. Then, slowly, painfully, she lowered them to her sides. She did not look at him. She did not move. He reached out, his motion slow and telegraphing his intent, and gently lifted the burlap sack from her head. Her hair was a mess of tangled straw, her face smudged with dirt and tears. But her eyes, when she finally lifted them, were not empty. They were vast and deep and held a guarded, watchful intelligence. She was not a broken thing. She was a fortress under siege. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the dusty track leading out of town, the one that led toward the silence of his land. Then he turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if she would follow. He trusted the instinct of a wounded creature to seek the quietest corner, the safest shadow. The journey home was etched in silence. He walked ahead, his long strides eating up the parched ground. He never looked back, but he could feel her presence behind him, a small, shuffling sound in the immense quiet of the plains. She was a ghost at his heels, clinging to him like a shadow. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer on the anvil of the earth. The air was thick with heat that shimmered above the cracked soil. The landscape was a palette of muted earth tones, ochre, rust, and the pale, washed-out green of stubborn sagebrush. It was a land that demanded resilience, that stripped away everything but the essential. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder and turned. He didn't move toward her, but held it out, an offering. She hesitated, her eyes wide and wary, like a deer catching a strange scent on the wind. Her gaze darted from the canteen to his face and back again. He remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Finally, she took a few shuffling steps forward. Her fingers, thin and grimy, brushed against his as she took the canteen. The touch was electric, a brief spark of human connection in the vast, empty wilderness. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin and making dark tracks in the dust on her neck. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held the canteen out to him. He took it, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking again. The first kindness had been offered and accepted. A contract had been drawn in the dust, unspoken but understood. His homestead appeared on the horizon hours later, a low, solid shape hunkered down against the endless sky. The cabin was made of weathered pine, its silvered planks speaking of long winters and blistering summers. It was not a welcoming place, but it was sturdy. It endured. Beside it stood a stooped cottonwood tree, and beneath the tree, a single, simple wooden cross marked a patch of raised earth. The land itself was holding its breath. The silence here was different from the silence of the journey. It was heavier, filled with the weight of memory. The air inside the cabin was cool and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was starkly furnished. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot against one wall. Everything was clean, ordered, and profoundly lonely. On the floor near the hearth, another cot had been prepared. A clean, thick wool blanket was folded neatly on top of it. He gestured toward it. "That's for you," he said. His voice, unused to filling a room, sounded like it came from under floorboards. It was the first thing he'd said to her directly. She looked at the cot, then at the single-barred window, then at the door. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the fear of a cage. "I don't lock doors," he added, his voice low. He turned and walked outside, leaving the door standing open behind him. He went to the woodpile and began to chop firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the encroaching dusk. He was giving her space, a choice. Inside the quiet cabin, she sank onto the edge of the cot, the soft wool a shocking comfort against her skin, and listened to the sound of the axe as the shadows grew long. Days bled into one another, measured not by a clock but by the rising and setting of the sun. A rhythm began to form, a silent dance of shared space and separate work. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet, and be out tending to his few head of cattle before the sky had fully lightened. She would wake to the scent of coffee and the sight of a piece of bread and a slice of dried meat left for her on the table. First, she did nothing. She sat on her cot, a small, still figure wrapped in the wool blanket, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the gloom of the cabin. The house itself seemed to be watching her, its wooden bones groaning in the wind. It was a place haunted by an absence, and she was careful not to disturb the ghosts. Then, one morning, Elias returned to the cabin at midday to find that the floor had been swept. The broom, made of bound twigs, was propped neatly by the door. He said nothing. He simply looked at the clean floorboards, then at her where she sat in her usual spot. She didn't meet his gaze. But the next day, a bowl of water and a clean rag had been left by his cot. They were stitching their lives together with these raw, silent threads. He would mend a broken fence post. She would patch a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and even. He would leave a bucket of fresh well water by the door. She would use it to scrub the tabletop until the pale grain of the wood shone through. One afternoon, while he was gone, she wandered out to the lone grave under the cottonwood. The wooden cross was weathered, the name Martha barely legible. She knelt in the dry grass and, with her bare hands, began to pull the weeds that grew around the base of the grave. When she was finished, she found a single stubborn prairie wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow, and laid it on the packed earth. Elias saw it when he returned at dusk. He stopped his horse a ways off and just looked at the spot of color against the brown earth. He didn't acknowledge it, not to her. But that evening, as the air grew cold, he draped a heavy woolen shawl over the back of her chair before he went to his own cot. It was Martha's. The fabric still held the faint scent of lavender and cedar. The slow thaw was interrupted one night by a sound. A small, choked cry from the darkness. Elias sat up on his cot, his senses instantly on alert. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. He heard the sound again, a desperate whimper, followed by the frantic rustle of the blanket. She was caught in a nightmare, thrashing in the grip of some unseen terror. He rose from his cot, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He did not go to her, did not touch her. That would be a trespass. Instead, he walked to the hearth and added a few small logs to the embers. The fire caught, crackling to life, pushing back the shadows. The sudden light and warmth seemed to penetrate her dream. Her thrashing subsided, her breathing slowly evening out. He stood by the fire, his back to her, a silent guardian watching the flames. He stayed there until the gray light of dawn began to creep through the window. She was awake when he finally turned. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide and filled with a question she didn't know how to ask. He saw the sheen of sweat on her brow, the terror still lingering in the corners of her eyes. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then she gave a single, slow nod. "I know," he said. It was not an offer of pity, but a statement of shared fact, a recognition. He turned and began to make the morning coffee, the familiar ritual, a quiet promise that the night was over, and they had both survived it. The peace they had built was as fragile as a skim of ice on morning water. It was shattered by the sight of 3 riders on the horizon, dark figures materializing out of the heat haze. They moved with a purpose that was not friendly. Elias saw them from the west pasture, where he was checking on a newborn calf. He straightened up slowly, his hand resting on the handle of the axe tucked into his belt. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, who they were. He walked back to the cabin, his stride unhurried but firm. She was outside, hanging a washed shirt on the line he had strung between the cabin and the cottonwood tree. She saw the riders too, and her hands froze on the damp cloth. All the life he had seen slowly returned to her face, drained away, leaving behind the stark, familiar mask of fear. The color bled from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of ash. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and even. He didn't look at her, his eyes were fixed on the approaching men. "Stay away from the window." She scurried into the cabin without a word, the screen door slamming shut with a sound that was unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense silence. Brant reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his 2 hired men flanking him. He sat tall in his saddle, a smirk playing on his lips. He surveyed the small homestead, the mended fence, the neat woodpile, the shirt drying on the line. His gaze was proprietary, as if he were inspecting goods he had left in storage. "Elias," he called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. "Didn't figure you for the domestic type." Elias didn't answer. He simply stood his ground, a silent, unmovable obstacle between the riders and his home. His stillness was more intimidating than any shouted threat. "I've come for my property," Brant said, dropping the pretense. "The law's on my side. I got a bill of sale right here." He patted a pocket on his vest. "You got your use out of her. A fair trade for a handful of coins. But the arrangement is over." Elias's eyes were like chips of flint. "She's not property." Brant laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Ain't she? What else would you call her? She ain't got a name, ain't got a family. She's a stray. I found her, I own her. That's the way of the world." He swung down from his horse, his boots thudding onto the hard-packed earth. His men remained mounted, their hands resting near their hips. "You bought her for 5 coins, Elias said, his voice flat. "A purchase is a purchase." "That was a rental," Brant sneered, taking a step forward. "A down payment. Now I'm here to collect the balance." He gestured toward the cabin. "Send her out. Let's not make this unpleasant." The land itself seemed to have fallen silent. The wind died down. The chirping of insects ceased. The world was a held breath, waiting. Elias did not move, did not speak. He just watched Brant, his presence a solid wall. The fire Brant saw in the man's eyes wasn't hot anger. It was something colder, deeper. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose, and had, impossibly, found something he refused to let go of. Brant took another step, his patience wearing thin. "I ain't asking again, old man." He made to push past Elias to get to the cabin door. But Elias shifted his weight, blocking him. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't have to. His body was a simple, clear statement. You will not pass. Get out of my way, Brant snarled, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered at his side. She stays, Elias said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an oath. It was then that the cabin door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, framed by the dark interior of the house. She was no longer the cowering creature from the town square. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes, which for so long had been fixed on the ground, were now locked on Brant's face. In her hands, she held the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She held it not like a weapon she was practiced with, but like a shield, a declaration. Brant stopped, genuinely surprised. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected this quiet, blazing defiance. He looked from her to Elias, seeing them not as a man and his possession, but as a unified front, a fortress of two. You see, he said with a nervous laugh, trying to regain control. She's a wild thing, needs a firm hand. He reached for her. It happened fast. She didn't scream. She didn't shrink away. She took one step forward and swung the iron poker. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was swift and sure, and it connected with Brant's outstretched hand with a sickening crack. He howled, stumbling back, clutching his hand. His face was a mask of shock and pain. His two hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles, their bravado suddenly evaporating. This was more trouble than they had been paid for. They looked at Elias, who still hadn't moved, and at the girl with the fire in her eyes, and they saw a fight that was not worth having. She broke my hand, Brant stammered, his voice thin with disbelief. You're trespassing, Elias said, his voice still low and steady. Leave, now. Brant looked at his men for support, but they avoided his gaze, their eyes on the horizon. He was alone, beaten not by force but by a courage he could not comprehend. He spat on the ground, a final, futile gesture of contempt. This ain't over, he hissed, cradling his injured hand. He clambered back onto his horse, his movements clumsy and pained. He cast one last look of pure hatred at the two of them standing before the cabin, then spurred his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. They stood there, Elias on the packed earth and she in the doorway, and watched until the riders were nothing more than small, dark specks disappearing back into the heat haze from which they had come. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was not empty. It was earned. She looked down at the poker still clutched in her hand, as if surprised to see it there. Her knuckles were white. Then she looked at Elias. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw not fear or gratitude, but a shared strength. That night, they sat by the fire, the flames dancing and casting warm, flickering light on the cabin walls. The tension had drained out of the air, leaving behind a profound and weary peace. She had her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. He was cleaning his knife, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone a soothing sound. I was scared, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had offered a piece of herself, a window into her own heart. He stopped his work and looked at her. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face. I know, he answered. So was I. He put the knife away. She took a sip of her tea. In the shared quiet, a new foundation was settling. It was built not of words, but of a shared battle, a silent promise kept. The house, which had been a shelter, was beginning to feel like a home. In the days that followed, the unspoken contract between them was rewritten. The air in the cabin was lighter. The silence was no longer a space to hide in, but a comfortable quiet to be shared. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without the need for clumsy words. One evening, as they sat on the small porch watching the sky bleed into a palette of blood orange and deep violet, he turned to her. They never called you by a name, he said. It wasn't a question. She shook her head, her eyes on the distant horizon. It was a thing they took. Like my shoes. He was quiet for a long time, watching the first stars appear. "My mother's name was Lena," he said softly. "It means light." He didn't offer it to her, not directly. He just placed the name in the space between them, a gift she could choose to accept or leave. She turned the name over in her mind. Lena. It felt strange, like a new coat that hadn't yet formed to her shoulders. But it felt clean, felt like her own. She looked at him, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fragile thing, but it transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Lena," she repeated, tasting the sound of it. "I like that." The name was an anchor. It was a beginning. The next morning, she gathered the ragged, filthy dress and the burlap sack she had arrived in. She took them to the fire pit behind the cabin. Elias came and stood beside her. He didn't ask what she was doing. He knew. He struck a match and held it out to her. She took it and touched the small flame to the edge of the burlap. It caught immediately, curling and blackening before erupting into a hungry orange fire. They watched together as the flames consumed the symbols of her past, turning them into smoke and ash. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. When it was done, and only a pile of gray powder remained, she felt a profound lightness, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Later that week, they rebuilt the section of fence Brant's horses had knocked over. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, practiced rhythm. He dug the post holes in the hard earth. She held the new posts steady while he packed the dirt around them. He stretched the wire. She hammered in the staples. They were building something more than a fence. They were mending the boundaries of their world, making it safe, making it theirs. Their life settled into a new pattern, one of quiet companionship. They shared meals at the small table. They sat on the porch in the evenings. He would whittle small, intricate birds from scraps of wood. She would hum a quiet, forgotten tune while she mended his clothes. The ghosts in the cabin grew quiet, replaced by the warmth of the living. The house, once hollow and haunted, began to breathe again. One evening, as dusk settled like a soft, gray blanket over the land, they sat on the porch steps, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. A feeling of peace, so deep and settled it felt ancient, lay between them. She leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. He did not flinch or pull away. He remained still, a solid, comforting presence beside her. The lonely cabin on the vast, empty plains was no longer empty. It held two people who had been broken by the world and had, in the quiet spaces of their shared solitude, found a way to piece each other back together. They had found not a roaring fire of passion, but the steady, enduring warmth of a hearth fire, a light to keep the darkness at bay. And for them, it was more than enough. It was everything. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's about recognizing the humanity in a person when everyone else sees a thing to be used or discarded. It's about the quiet courage it takes to offer a hand, not out of pity, but out of a shared understanding of what it means to be broken. Elias didn't see a piece of property tied to a post. He saw the reflection of his own solitude, his own loss. And in that reflection, he found a reason to act, to push back against the cruelty of the world, even in one small, silent way. He cut the ropes, yes, but the real freedom came later. It came in the sharing of water, in the leaving of a blanket, in the speaking of a name. So here's your naming. Life will try to put a sack over your head, to label you, to tie you to a post of its own making. It will try to tell you what you're worth, what you're for. But your true self, your own name, is always waiting underneath. Sometimes you have to find the courage to claim it yourself. And sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, someone comes along who sees you, truly sees you, and in their eyes you see the person you were always meant to be. The world can be a harsh, unforgiving place. But even in the dust and the silence, there is the possibility of grace. There is the hope of a shared meal, a warm fire, a hand to stand with you against the coming storm. You just have to be brave enough to look for it. And if you're brave, You might find that what you thought was an empty house is just a home waiting for you to breathe life back into it.